For the majority of people, or at the very least the majority of millennials and elder Gen Zs, their first exposure to the concept of the Greek chorus comes from Disney's 1997 classic, Hercules. Disney's Hercules came out right at the peak of what is considered to be the studio's renaissance in animation. Starting with The Little Mermaid, the studio would then go on to release multiple critically acclaimed and box office hits, culminating with 1999's Tarzan. The movie Hercules tells the story of a young demigod by the same name as he rises in fame in the ancient Grecian world. Through trials and tribulations, he meets a woman named Megara, or Meg for short, and they have this little will they won't they love affair, where ultimately Hercules must save Meg from the evil yet flamingly homosexual god of the underworld, Hades. The movie is intercut with multiple catchy songs and an intense amount of references to 90s pop culture and Hollywood. Hercules' intended audience by the studio was towards young boys. Because this is the 90s we are talking about, we have to make the distinction that princesses in pink are for girls and muscled men on a blue backdrop are for boys. We really have not progressed much as a society when it comes to this point in gender roles, but I digress. The fact that this was specifically made for boys is kind of surprising to me. Between Meg, Hades, and the absolutely iconic portrayal of the Muses, one would think this to simply be a general kids movie. Sure, people will remember I Will Go Far and Robert De Niro, and I mean, Hercules' bod alone would have caused many a gay awakening. But truly, the women and the queer-coded villain are what make this movie go down in history as one of Disney's greatest. I mean, think of all the drag performances to I Won't Say I'm in Love. But to go back to the Muses and the title of this episode, these amazingly talented R&B and pop idols gave their all to these performances, and ultimately, the story itself. The Muses act as the narrative structure in which we, the audience, consume Hercules' story. They pop in from time to time to move the story along, provide exposition, and interact with the characters and audiences alike from an invisible and not so invisible standpoint. But what does this 90s cartoon have to do with horror? Why focus on the Muses in the chorus? I mean, this has a happy ending. It's not even a tragedy, right? Welcome to the first episode of Sinister Seminar. I'm so excited to be going on this journey with you as we explore where horror came from, its themes, its symbols, its stories, its motifs, everything. If you haven't already, go check out episode 0. It kind of lays out the syllabus for this quote unquote course and provides more info on who I am and why I started this podcast. You will also be able to find a full script, bibliography, and works cited, as well as a reading list that coincides with each season, all on the website. Link in the show notes and all of my socials. With that, I guess class is in session. The Madness of Heracles is a play written by Euripides and performed around 416 BCE. To sum up the plot, while Heracles is off performing the final acts of his labors, his wife Megara and their children seek refuge within the city of Thebes at the altar of Zeus alongside Heracles' human father Amphitryon. The city of Thebes is under siege by a man named Lycus, and in his claws for power, he plans on murdering Heracles' entire family, as Megara is the daughter of the current king of Thebes, Creon. It is Megara who slams her fist against the ground, praying for Heracles' return from the underworld. And he does, killing Lycus before he has the chance to murder his entire family. But, dear listener, this is not where the play ends. Hera, seeing that Heracles has returned from the house of Hades, sends the goddesses Iris and Madness to make Heracles mad and kill his family. And that they do. The audience in the chorus are forced to look on at the once heroic Heracles commit such intense acts of violence against the loves of his life. It is the goddess Athena that strikes him down, saving Amphitryon from doom. Now out of his madness, he is tied up to the column that has struck him down and is surrounded by the bodies of his wife and children. Upon waking up, he tearfully breaks down about his actions, begging for death himself. A former friend of his, an important member of the mythos, Theseus, finds Heracles and comforts him in a totally no-homo way. Theseus essentially tells him through the power of friendship every wound can be healed. And also the gods commit many outrageous and despicable acts against humans and still be praised, so why can't he, son of Zeus, also be given the same right? Theseus brings Heracles back to Athens as a refugee. Heracles asks Amphitryon to stay and bury his wife and kids as law forbids him from staying for their funeral because, he murdered them. Exit stage right, and all is well. Euripides takes a major aspect to the original myth and turns it on its head. He reverses the order of events. So, in the original myth, Heracles kills Megara and his kids, and as a punishment, must perform 12 impossible labors as atonement for his crimes. The big question: why? Why must these events be reordered for an Athenian audience circa 416 BCE, who surely knows the original story? Well, culturally, we should start with the Great Dionysia in Athens, which was a yearly festival held to honor the god Dionysus. Playwrights would compete for best play in the categories of tragedy, comedy, and satyr plays, and the entire city, as well as many foreign sailors, would spend days watching the revelries. Think Fantastic Fest, TIFF, and Sundance as a modern example of the Great Dionysia, though these plays would be performed in great amphitheaters and in direct sunlight. Over the course of a week, up to 17 plays would be performed. The displays of the Great Dionysia would have likely happened every year, though some scholars do believe that in times of great peril and siege, the festivals would have been cancelled, which, makes sense. In the context of 416, during the writing of the Madness of Heracles, Euripides would have been drawing from the Peloponnesian War, a war between Athens and Sparta. The classical scholar Dr. Johanna Henink states this concept very well, I think. She says, "The plays that were written and performed in Athens formed a picture that was set firmly and significantly within the frame of the festival. That frame affected how the picture was viewed, even as the picture served to cast its frame in a new light. The audience watching this play would have been composed of soldiers coming back from war and their families, many of which would have come back with what we know today as PTSD from their times at war. It is thought that the audience were made to find catharsis in the final acts of Theseus and Heracles, that brotherhood and friendship would help guide them through their own madnesses of war. In that case, that is where the chorus comes in." Before we get into the chorus portrayed in the Madness of Heracles, let's lay a groundwork of what the chorus even is, how it performed, what its function is, and how we portray the chorus in modern interpretations of these ancient plays. The chorus would have traditionally been a group of 12 to 15 people. In ancient Greece, this group would have been made up solely of men, though in modern adaptations we see a much more diverse group of players. The chorus would be made up of tradespeople, attendants, friends of the main characters, artisans, townsfolk, really anyone that would make up the backdrop to a rich and thriving story. It is in that the audience finds themselves portrayed in each of these plays. It is here that the chorus begins to set the wheels of catharsis in motion. On the National Theatre's YouTube channel, there are many a video on the way their theater handles their interpretations of ancient texts. And in these videos, they often interview the scholar Dr. Lucy Jackson, who is a powerhouse in my ability to structure and understand the chorus. So I would highly suggest checking out the National Theatre's YouTube channel for more information. In the modern day, she notes that it is quite hard for modern audiences to connect with the chorus, which makes sense. This is a tradition that is thousands of years old, and we have traveled through centuries of narrative structures being solidified and restructured within the canon. So this group of singing and dancing performers, ushering the narrative forward, feels almost redundant in the modern day. Think of it, if there were a group of players in The Substance narrating how Elizabeth feels opening the box to the substance, we'd think it kind of corny. It is in the struggle that directors of the theater find the most creativity. In the National Theatre's rendition of Women of Troy, director Katie Mitchell talks about her choice of comprising the chorus as these almost ghostly widows and bridesmaids. She says, "The ancient Greeks combined spoken text with sung text and dance, so I wanted in conceiving our chorus to honor that. So, of course, they have the spoken text which they deliver directly to the audience. But also they do dancing in Women of Troy. We're using dance without the men, so by putting their arms up and the women dancing, it reminds the audience of the absent men who've been killed in the conflict." Dr. Lucy Jackson also discusses their choices of the chorus in Antigone, as made into a group of individual roles. They had their own individual identities, they spoke as individuals. You had almost a conversation going on, you had differing opinions coming out, so in a way, the unity of the chorus was exploded. I think this is an especially interesting interpretation of the chorus, especially given the context of that play and the controversial nature of Antigone's actions. But, kind of going back, the tradition of the chorus did not pop up out of nowhere. The chorus sprouted from the tradition of the dithyramb, which was a large group of choral performers who would tell the stories of legend, most often those that involve the god Dionysus, as the tradition was most likely originated in Delos, an area known for its ancient worship of the aforementioned god. The Dithyramb would be transplanted into the great Dionysia in their own accord, even being mentioned within Aristotle's On Poetics, but referred to in a completely different art form than the tragedy. So it is not all too much of a leap to assume that the original Dithyramb and the Athenian Dithyramb acted with different purposes. Dr. Lucy Jackson on the Dithyramb states, this was a certain kind of song and dance where myth was related by a chorus of performers. Aristotle implies that tragedy was invented when an individual separated themselves from this chorus, allowing there to be a conversation between this individual and the myth telling. When we think back to the madness of Heracles, we see the tragic Heracles having taken a stance away from the old men of the chorus, being different but all too familiar to the audience's struggles. The only thing separating these older men from succumbing to the same fate as Heracles being the possibility that they have themselves to console and comfort each other, to act as a Theseus if one of them goes mad, all standing on the precipice of horror. The madness of Heracles is a tragedy through and through, though, given the hopeful and uplifting end of the play, a modern audience may be confused as to how this constitutes a tragedy. After all, early on we learned that tragedy equals someone dies and comedy equals someone gets married. The ancient Greeks would have had a different relationship to the concept of tragedy, and the majority of that comes from their Aristotelian concept of catharsis. Now, I've referred to the term catharsis a few times in this recording, and this is the crux, the meat and potatoes, as to the connection to modern day horror. Once again, catharsis now and catharsis to Aristotle are two different aesthetic concepts. Now we think of catharsis as our ability to relate and come to an emotional climax at a narrative, not always in tears, but in laughter, disturbance, eros, disgust, that warm, fuzzy feeling that you can't quite put the name to when you see the ending of Dead Poets Society. To Aristotle, the act of catharsis would simply be categorized as pity and fear. It was the mimetic nature of seeing the horrors unfold to our tragic hero coinciding with the chorus witnessing said horrors that an audience will reach catharsis. For anyone who may not know what mimetic means or what mimesis is, it is simply the aesthetic philosophy that an artist will hold up a mirror to the world that surrounds them. And this is a widely debated topic that we will not get into today, but is the reason we have so many different art movements and why we can trace literary history as well as we can. The scholar Anton Bierl writes, tragedians are, so to speak, masters of emotions, creating fear, horror, and terror through mimesis. Moreover, especially in Aeschylus, we witness a permanent concern with healing, with pharmaceutical akos against the displeasures, the dysphemic and the disruptive elements, especially on the level of the chorus. The ritual production of emotions and the intense audience stimulation lead to a ritual purification of these emotions by living them through. This reflects the homeopathic understanding of healing and ritual catharmoi. In this, Beryl brings up the interplay of the chorus, catharsis, and mimesis. Each of the aforementioned structures work together like cogs in a machine to move the audience forward, to reach an emotional climax, specifically that in what we associate with the horror genre today. To quote from Aristotle himself, for we should not seek every kind of pleasure from tragedy, but only the sort which is particular to it, since the poet should use representation to produce the pleasure arising from pity and terror. This fascinates me for many reasons, but primarily because the author and Aristotle scholar Jonathan Layer discusses in depth of the many ways in which Aristotle could mean catharsis in his writings, before finally settling on its meaning as the pleasure in pain. Given that this translation of On Poetics by Richard Jenka was published in 1987 and this examination by Layer came out a year later, I wonder if these two writers were in conversation with each other. I do highly recommend reading Layer's essay Catharsis, because it is quite a fascinating read and does an excellent job at providing context of ancient Athenian life. I think now would be a good time to really examine some of Aristotle's On Poetics, and see if we can discern more of his thoughts on the theatre of then and where we can bring it into the modern. Aristotle discusses the ideal tragedy in his Poetics in the way many of us are taught to understand ancient theatre. The hero must have a tragic flaw to be relatable to an audience. The most often flaw we modern audiences can identify being hubris. Aristotle states, such a person is one who neither is superior to us in virtue and justice, nor undergoes a change to misfortune because of vice and wickedness, but because of some error. And who is one of those people with a great reputation and a good fortune? Aristotle would later diss on Euripides' plays, but also state he was great at portraying the bleakest of tragedies, which is not that important to bring up, but I think it funny since we are talking about Euripides here. Aristotle also believes there to be four different subcategories of tragedies: the complex tragedy, the tragedy of suffering, the tragedy of character, and the tragedy of spectacle. Euripides continues to be dismissed by Aristotle as he talks about the chorus, stating, "The poet should regard the chorus as one of the actors. It should be a part of the whole and contribute to the performance, not as in Euripides, but as in Sophocles. And the rest the sung parts belong to the plot no more than they belong to another tragedy. For this reason, they sing interludes." Thinking back on the madness of Heracles, we can see many of these Aristotelian concepts come to life. Heracles is essentially the ancient Greek Superman. He is impenetrable and is often to be considered the most heroic out of all the ancient heroes, next to Odysseus, of course. Euripides, in this sense, somewhat defies Aristotle's argument on the tragic hero, or at least takes an alternate route to the same destination. Heracles' flaw is his madness and his anger, the former onset by the wrath of the gods, which does not really make it a human flaw in a sense. But I do believe that through the chorus and the historical context of ancient PTSD, the audience of the time would have found relatability in the sudden onset of madness, as it was so suddenly placed upon them too. The madness of Heracles at the end of the day is a tragedy of character. The Heracles we know is not the same Heracles that returns to Athens. He is supposed to be brave and impenetrable, though perhaps through the acts of friendship and companionship, he finds his final act of bravery, the ability to continue living. We see this bravery to continue living quite often in horror. We see this in every final girl, who at the death of her friends and community, she finds the strength to defy evil and live to see another day in spite. We see this in the zombie movie, a cast of characters who continue living despite the end of humanity because it is our ability to find community that maintains civilization. We see this in existentialist horror. Despite the feelings of insignificance, we find peace in knowing that our actions and legacies are in the lives we touch. Our characters live to see another day because the chorus, the community, it is what we fight for. Where does the chorus factor into the way we tell stories now? How has the central piece of art evolved over the centuries? Well, to answer these questions simply, the chorus has become the audience surrogate. For anyone who doesn't know what the audience surrogate is, let me give a quick rundown using the website Tropedia. I know, very legit. It lists the audience surrogate as being 1. The viewpoint character, 2. A character who asks questions the audience would ask and say things the audience would say, 3. A character who the audience, or the children in the audience, doesn't just sympathize with, but are supposed to actively see themselves as, by desire, by default, or by author interference. According to Thomas Blakely, a fellow New School alumni and writer for Rain Dance, the audience surrogate acts as subtle exposition, a writer's tool to build a world seamlessly without writing in pages of exposition that could possibly bore or even confuse the audience. At its core, in genre works particularly, the audience surrogate is a mostly bland character that the majority of the audience can map their own experiences onto. I have also heard this archetype be called the quote-unquote straight man, though in the modern day that is not always representative of who the audience surrogate tends to be. The purpose of the audience surrogate is to place the audience in the shoes of the main character, to help them experience the horror, the fantasy, the science fiction of it all. Sound familiar? The funny thing is, I have not seen many scholars make the connection between the audience surrogate and the Greek chorus. Could it possibly be because the audience surrogate is one person and the Greek chorus is many? Maybe. Maybe this is my own crazy theory that has no academic backing to it, but I sincerely doubt that. I am sure that somewhere in the recesses of JSTOR and Google Scholar, there is an article that I'm not quite finding. What I have found is an article by Robert Egan, published in the summer of 1981, that analyzes the character of Kent in Shakespeare's King Lear. Egan states, Kent has been noticed often enough by critics as an onstage audience surrogate, one of Shakespeare's several attendant or choral figures. So it is not too far of a reach if other academics have at the very least adjacently made this comparison. But when it comes to the direct ancient Greek chorus, not much is to be said, besides adjacent theories. In Helene Foley's essay, she discusses the socio-political and practical identities of the Greek chorus. In a line, she states, "We are generally told that Greek tragic choruses must be marginal, because choruses, in contrast to tragic characters, cannot, by the conventions of the tragic state, initiate, control, or take action." Though choruses retain a certain degree of mobility, their effective interventions are verbal rather than physical. I wanted to pull this quote from the text because it reminds me of the audience surrogate archetype. The character that is the audience surrogate, in general, has no motivations beyond their adjacency to the more interesting main character. What this character says, what they ask, how they react, is more important than what they will ever do, as, more often than not, they are primed for the slaughter. In this section of the season, we will actually not be covering movies that have an audience surrogate. Why? Because that is pretty much every movie ever. I could throw a dart at any movie and be able to pick a character that has no clue what is going on. Instead, I want to see how directors have creatively interpreted the Greek chorus, much like how the National Theatre has interpreted their choruses over time. I think it may finally be time to move on to the movie portion of this lesson. Over the next 3 weeks, we will be going over and discussing 3 movies that I think portray the overall concept of the Greek chorus in varying degrees. To start, this isn't quite a movie. I mean, it is. It's a recording, at least. I wanted to start with the absolute basic example of the chorus to act as a sort of control to this experiment. So next week, join me in watching Terry Hughes' 1982 film adaptation of the stage musical that is Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, starring the icon Angela Lansbury. Keep in mind, this is not Tim Burton's Sweeney Todd. I may mention it, but we are not covering it for hopefully obvious reasons, though I do admit I enjoy it. You can find the 1982 stage recording streaming on Broadway HD or through a free trial on Amazon Prime, or you can rent it on Apple TV for $3.99. I also want to encourage everyone to take a look at today's bibliography and works cited on the website to view any of the readings mentioned today, as well as other bonus essays that helped inform my knowledge on this specific subject. With that, see you next week, and stay tuned for credits. Class is dismissed. This podcast is researched, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Richard Berwind. You can find more of me on Instagram at Richard J. Boy. That's Richard J. Boii, or on Twitter at BerwindRichard. Though, if you voyaged away from Twitter, you can find me on Blue Sky at richardberwind.bsky.social. You can follow this podcast everywhere at Sinister Seminar, including Blue Sky, Twitter, and Instagram. Make sure to hit follow and leave a like, comment, and rating on your podcatcher of choice. Thank you for listening.